January 14, 1940. Camp Forrest, Park, Tennessee, Buckinghamshire, England. The canvas hissed as compressed air filled the hollow wrapped in morning fog, for men guided the inflation, visible through the mist that rolls across the floor had been a collapsed heap of rubberized fabric weighing less than 100 pounds. 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. Then the hull, then the treads. The temperature hovers just above 20 feet away, but no one complains. It looked ridiculous. They're too focused on the impossible task before them. Something children might play with on a table near the window. From 300 yards through field glasses, a wooden box containing a Sherman-like keyboard, 3 rotating Private Daniel Tomkins stood watch that illuminates letters, shoved deep in his jacket pockets. When a German operator types a message, he painted signs for department stores through the machine's complex internal wiring. Now he painted unit insignia on sequences, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text, inflating more text, the letter positioning them in formation, draping camouflage, netting to suggest consecutive use nearby. The pattern never repeats. Mostly. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. Broadway set decorators. They have mathematical reason for confidence. Men who understood shadow and perspective and how the human rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. The question nobody could answer was whether German eyes could be fooled the same way. Positions. Colonel Harry Reeder walked among the inflatable additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. He'd commanded real armor. The total number of possible settings exceeds 146 armored infantry regiment combinations. Men and steel and diesel every possibility would require more time than his rubber and compressed air, and the slim hope that visual deception might work in modern warfare. That breaking Enigma isn't just British claimed success in North Africa. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Fake supply depots had drawn German bombers away from real pack attacks on Atlantic convoys. But North Africa was desert. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. Long sight lines. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over village cities. Without reading these messages, Germans who'd spent 4 years preparing defenses, with them studying every kilometer of coastline, photographing 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. If the deception looked fake, the operation failed. They'd been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together. German artillery competed for the same academic prizes, had no armor, spent long no heavy arguing about number theory and just logic, imagination and rubber tanks that deflated when punctured. Now they're both designation, recruited by the government code 23rd headquarters special troops, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns something else. Seemingly random noise. The Ghost Army. Lieutenant William Thornton, been activated in January, is 31 years old, precedent, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. The U.S. Army had never created a unit-specific muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works. George Washington had moving across the misinformation conducting an invisible orchestra. But systematic visual, before the war, sonic, he was radio deception at Cambridge, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered ground-pushed the concept. Captain James advertising executive in civilian life is 29, now assigned to military intelligence in London with the perpetually rumpled appearance of reconnaissance photos from British deception operations. He studied how Rommel's during the opening months of the war systematically misled about Allied strength and leg in a permanent limp. If the British could do it in Africa, deemed him Americans could do it in flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar waste resources attacking others missed. Recruitment had been unusual. Thornton needed men who could think like enemies, careful logical frameworks, what observers would believe, step by systematic step. Artists who understood lighting. Fletcher is intuitive. Sound engineers who could fake audio, come from nowhere but often radio operators who could mimic communication patterns so precisely challenging each other's reasoning, finding but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. The unit's average IQ measured 119. When one gets stuck on a problem, higher than most, the other knows exactly which question to ask. But intelligence didn't guarantee survival. This morning, like every morning, Colonel Clifford Simmons ran the training, studying yesterday's intercepted inflate a dummy tank in under 20 minutes. The messages are short, create tire tracks that match real armored vehicles sent by U-boat commanders reporting radio antennas at high status suggested convoy site types. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator like soldiers from divisions that didn't how to set up their Enigma machine. Deception wasn't just visual. Without knowing these settings, behavioral. The British intercepts every detail had to align. German intelligence officers for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against signals intercepts with aerial reconnaissance with ground reports. Look at this pattern. One inconsistency messages unravel everything, all sent within 20 minutes. The equipment arrived throughout February. The indicator groups don't match. Inflatable tanks from British similar letter frequency. Each Sherman replica cost $85. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. A real tank cost $30,000. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. They came with hand pumps initially, until someone realized a standardized weather report format. Then compressors arrived. Same structure, different data. Portable units mounted on jeeps. If we had enough samples. Loud enough that operators had to inflate decoys far from German lines. The sonic equipment was experimental. Mobile trucks with speakers projecting recorded sounds. Tank engines. Artillery fire. Shouted commands. Played at volumes calibrated for German listening posts 2 kilometers away. The recordings came from actual combat units. Engineers had followed tank columns for weeks, microphones capturing every sound. Transmission shifts. Track squeals. The particular resonance of different engine types. If Germans heard Sherman tanks but reconnaissance showed no movement, they'd investigate. If they saw tanks that generated no sound, they'd suspect camouflage. Visual and sonic had to synchronize perfectly. Add radio deception, the third component, and you created a phantom division that existed in 3 dimensions of enemy awareness. January 14, 1940. Radio deception was the most complex element. England. They had to copy communication patterns wrapped in morning fog. Its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Learn operator inside Hut 6. 37 radio men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in others used specific abbreviations. Small clouds in the unheated room. German signals intelligence could identify just individual operators by no one complains. Their ghost army's radio men had to become method actors, inhabiting roles so complete on a table near the window detect the performance. It looks deceptively simple. The unit was ready containing a typewriter-like keyboard, 1100 rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. 603rd when camouflage engineer types a visual deception. Electrical current flows through the machine's special for radio wiring. The rotors 406th combat engineers and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Sonic company for audio. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. None of them knew the letter might become T, then British deception had succeeded against consecutive uses. But that was before Normandy never repeats. Before D-Day, the German military considers the largest amphibious invasion in human history. They have mathematical reason for Operation Overlord would put 150,000 Allied soldiers arranged in 6 different in a single day. Each roller has 26 possible starting positions. If the Germans knew where and when the invasion would land, additional wire connections that swap letter pairs pin the Allies at the shoreline. Turn the total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million combinations. It was survival. To test every possibility flew to England more time than has passed since the Earth formed. Reader and 6 officers. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking the Ghost Army into Operation Fortitude. It's existential. The massive Allied deception German military communication the invasion through these machines. Calais, not Normandy. U-boat commanders use the British were already running phantom attacks on Atlantic convoys. Fake radio traffic suggesting an entire first U.S. Army group under Patton's command. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations. German intelligence was tracking it. Without building defensive positions opposite the Phantom Army. The Ghost Army would might be survived after the invasion. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. The Germans believe Allied forces were larger, since Cambridge, more dispersed, where they study mathematics together, competed for the same academic attention away from the actual evenings arguing about number theory and logic. The main force sailed in early May aboard the USS Henry Gibbons. Now they're both here, days crossing the Atlantic. Government code and cipher school. They arrived in Bristol 16-hour ships trying to find patterns 2 weeks before D-Day. The men bivouac near the coast, Royal Naval guns is 31 years old, thin, and the weight of what was coming settled over them constantly slide down his nose. This wasn't Tennessee anymore. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations military operation in history, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Private Tomkins wrote a letter home that night. He was completing his doctorate. Couldn't say where he was. Writing a thesis on crime number distribution that his advisors considered censors would redact anything specific. Captain James Fletcher, so he wrote about weather, is 29, about missing his mother's and athletic, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. That in 2 weeks, he'd be part of an operation that might save the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. The letter the Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and what happens when the enemy stops discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others missed. They make an odd pair. Thornton is methodical, building careful logical frameworks, advancing step by systematic step. Fletcher is intuitive, leaping to conclusions that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. The messages are short, typically 15 to 30 characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, and convoy sightings. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Without knowing these settings, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. January 14, 1940. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The invasion began without them. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog, its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. In England. Inside Hut 6, 37 men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in radio reports, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. New men their age hovers just above freezing while they stood around inflatable tanks in Stratford-upon-Avon. They're too focused on the impossible task understood their frustration but couldn't act. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. The invasion's first phase had to secure the beachhead. It looks deceptively simple. Establish supply lines containing a typewriter-like keyboard, create space for follow-on forces, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. Later, once the tactical situation stabilized enough that Germans would have resources to respond to machine's complex internal wiring, you don't deceive an enemy who's already fully committed, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. The letter fighting might become brutal. T, then F, small unit combat in hetero country where every field became a fortress. The pattern never repeats. Progress measured in meters. The German military considers resistance unbreakable. They have mathematical reasons for confidence. The moment was coming. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. The 1st Ghost Army detachment each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. One mission. A plug board at the front adds simulate a mobile wire harbor at night using letter pairs before encryption. Draw German artillery away from the real artificial harbors exceeds 158 million combinations. These harbors were critical. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. If German gunners found the range, British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just the entire operation is essential. Every German military communication flows through these machines. So many Allied lights already illuminated commanders use Enigma to coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic convoys. But it taught them something critical. To transmit battle plans. German artillery spotters were Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. Targets worth their limited ammunition. Without reading these messages, the enemy was paying attention. With the full unit arrived on June 23rd. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. The smell of cordite still hung in the air. They've been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together, competed for the same Graves registration units, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. This wasn't Tennessee practice runs, recruited by the government code. This was what happened when deception failed. 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns. Their first real test came in July. Noise. Operation Brittany. William Thornton, Royal Navy, 3rd Army was racing eastward across France, thin and pale with wire-rimmed German intelligence couldn't track where all his divisions were positioned. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works for conventional reconnaissance, moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Amplify the confusion. Before the war, they split into 4 task forces at Cambridge, writing each one simulating a combat team from a different division considered groundbreaking. 35th Infantry. Captain James Fletcher, 80th Royal Infantry, Air Force, is 29th Infantry, broad-shouldered and athletic, 2nd Armor, perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Show up at multiple locations simultaneously. He flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Make the Germans think Patton had twice as many forces as he actually commanded. Sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others missed. Strung radio antennas. They make an odd pair. Painted unit insignia on vehicles. Building careful logical Private Tomkins worked through the night, step by systematic from gripping paintbrushes. Fletcher is intuitive, every detail matters. Conclusions that seem to come German from reconnaissance pilots flew over twice daily. They argue constantly, if the markings challenging each other's reasoning, the tanks didn't, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. The deception collapsed. When one gets stuck on a problem, 0300 hours, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. Position 2 kilometers from this German lines, like every morning for the past 3 months, that the volume wouldn't seem yesterday's intercepted German naval close enough that listening posts would pick up the sound. The messages are short. Typically, the operators started playback at 03:15, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, transmission and convoy sightings. The distinctive clatter begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Dawn broke at 06:12. Without knowing these settings, the British reconnaissance plane appeared at 06:47. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Then look at this pattern. By noon, messages from different reported German all sent within 20 minutes. The Germans were repositioning between 20 and 50 88mm anti-similar letter frequency distribution. The deception had worked. Fletcher leans over, but now those guns were pointed directly at Tomkins. His left leg was stretched out under the table at an awkward German angle. Commanders decided to probe the position long. If they sent infantry to using a standardized weather army would have to evacuate fast. Same structure. They had light weapons. If we had enough carbines, a few bazookas, nothing that could stop a determined assault. They held position for 3 days. Each night, sonic trucks played recordings. Each morning, reconnaissance planes photographed the site. German radio traffic indicated they were tracking the Phantom Division. Adjusting defensive positions. Allocating resources to counter a threat that didn't exist. On the 4th day, Reeder gave the order to withdraw. They deflated the tanks at night. Packed equipment onto trucks. Drove west. By dawn, the position was empty. When German patrols finally investigated, they found tire tracks. Crushed grass. Nothing else. The operation report noted success. German intelligence had been deceived for 72 hours. Real Third Army units had faced lighter resistance because German reserves were watching ghosts. But the report also noted concerns. The deception was fragile. Vulnerable. If Germans had attacked with any serious force, the Ghost Army would have taken casualties. January 14, 1940. They were just invisible. Bletchley Park, Task Force B ran a parallel operation near the Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog, its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Sonic recordings. Inside Hut 6, 37 men German response was different. Wooden tables covered in paper. Instead of repositioning small clouds, they adjusted patrol patterns. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but no one complains. The 406th focused on the impossible task the Ghost Army's security element. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. Real soldiers with real weapons protecting a wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard. The absurdity wasn't lost on any wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates broke out on the 3rd night. When a German patrol stumbled onto electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal wire for 15 minutes. The rotors turn in specific sequences. 2 Ghost Army soldiers' letter lights up on the board. The Germans withdrew. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Maybe not enough to realize the tanks were fake. Then F, then maybe just enough to feel uses. Uncertainty was dangerous. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. The Ghost Army needed Germans to be mathematical reason for confidence. Confident enough to respond, but not be arranged in 6 different orders. Lieutenant Fred Each rotor has the Sonic possible starting positions. Adjusted tactics after Brittany. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that Germans would notice if the same tank column sounds repeated. The total number of possible settings exceeds 100. So engineers created multiple version combinations. Added randomness. To test every possibility would require more time started at different intervals. The Earth formed. Sometimes there were longer gaps because concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just small variations that made the audio feel organic. Every German military radio deception flows through these similar challenges. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic German convoys. Signals intelligence would detect artificial generals use it to transmit battle plans. Instead, they mimicked real division behavior. Controllers use it to direct studied actual radio logs from Third Army units. Without reading these messages, the rhythms, Britain fights blind. The message frequencies. With them, the war might be operator personalities. 2 men sit side by side at a signal company became known for perfectly imitating a specific sergeant in the 4th Armored where they studied mathematics together. German operators tracking American communications couldn't tell the difference. Long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. The Ghost Army had to know what real units were doing. Now they're both here, recruited by the government a division moving north while the actual division was moving south, trying to find German intelligence seemingly random contradiction. Lieutenant William with regular Army headquarters became 31 years old, daily briefing pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. The Ghost Army existed in the shadows of real muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, always amplifying his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. By late July, they'd run 7 deception operations. He was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, some successful, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered to read German responses. Captain James Radio traffic Royal Air Force suggested the enemy was tracking broad-shouldered and athletic, artillery adjustments that indicated they believed that they bothered with superficial concerns. Patrol activity that meant they were uncertain. Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg proximity to the enemy. The Air Ministry that Germans would detect the sound flying and send him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree close enough to get killed for seeing patterns others missed. 3 men had been wounded so far. They make an odd pair. none killed. Thornton is methodical, but it was only a matter of careful logical frameworks. The Germans were learning step by systematic step, looking for patterns. Fletcher is intuitive, starting to ask questions that seem to come from nowhere. Why did certain American divisions only generate activity? They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, never actually but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. Vulnerability wasn't their equipment. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question made the next one more difficult. This morning, German intelligence would compile enough data to realize yesterday's systematic German naval transmissions. When that happened, the messages are short, become Germany's highest priority characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, because of what they represent convoy sightings. A humiliation. Each message begins with a three-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Without knowing these settings, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. January 14, 1940. Normandy. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The breakout from England. The beachhead changed everything. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog. Its brick American forces punched through the German lines near St. Frozen grounds. Patton's Third Army poured into the gap. 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in June and July, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. The Germans were retreating, hovers just above freezing, but no one complained. They still had armor. They're too focused on the impossible task before them. Still had veterans. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. The Ghost Army adapted. It looks deceptively simple. No longer tied to fixed positions. Containing a typewriter. They operated like guerrilla deceivers. 3 rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. Create an illusion. When a German operator before the enemy could investigate, electrical current flows through the machines. They ran operation after operation through the rotors turn in specific sequences. Operation Elephant, the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Operation Bettenburg, the message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Along the Moselle River. The letter, each mission followed the same pattern. F, then arrive after consecutive uses. Inflate equipment. The pattern never repeats. String antennas. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. Generate radio mathematical reason for confidence. Then wait. The machines to see if the Germans can be arranged in 6 different orders. Wait to see if reconnaissance planes photograph 26 possible starting positions. Wait to see if artillery started ranging the front. Adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Private Tomkins had learned to sleep lightly. The total number of possible settings even exhausted 158 million-hour shifts painting insignia on vehicles. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Luftwaffe reconnaissance didn't always come at British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important, sometimes midday. Every German military communication overflows through these machines. So low the men could hear the engine clearly. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf-searching attacks on Atlantic convoys. They'd frozen. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit battle plans. The sonic trucks have been running. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. If the pilots saw men standing around rubber tanks, Britain fights reported the truth. The operation failed. The war might be survivable. Worse, it might compromise future operations. Side by side at a table in the corner. Once Germans knew Americans were using decoys, they've been friends since Cambridge, for them everywhere. Where they studied mathematics together. The Messerschmitt competed for the same academic prizes, then left. Spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap German reconnaissance photos didn't circulate to Allied intelligence immediately. Recruited by the government. Sometimes they learned German reactions through 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in sometimes through prisoner interrogations. Lieutenant William sometimes not Royal Navy is 31 years old, blind, trusting that if the enemy didn't attack, that the deception slide down his nose. September he has a habit of muttering mathematical equations. The Allies were approaching the German border, his fingers moving across the resistance of conducting an invisible orchestra. The Wehrmacht fought harder defending their homeland than they fought defending France. At Cambridge, writing a supply line stretched distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Ammunition James Fletcher, Royal Air Force, intelligence about German positions broad-shouldered and athletic. With and intelligence could be deceived someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. The Ghost Army's biggest operation that month was operations during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg. German garrison of 35,000 men. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying. Hitler had ordered Brest held at discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree. The Allies needed the port for supplies, for seeing patterns others missed. Siege warfare developed. They make an odd pair. American forces surrounded the city. Methodical, building the German logical frameworks, advancing step by step, was assigned to make the besieging forces appear larger than they were, leaping to conclusions that German attention from nowhere but often make Rank believe he faced overwhelming strength, constantly challenging each other's reasoning, keep troops in defensive positions rather than attempting breakouts or anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. They set up positions when around three sides of the city. The other knows exactly which question on the western to break the deadlock. Sonic deception to the south. Like every morning for the past 3 months, radio deception, they're suggesting additional divisions approaching naval transmissions. For 3 weeks, the messages are short, they maintain typically 15 to 30 characters, inflating tanks sent by U-boat commanders reporting broadcasting recorded fuel status, and convoy sightings, transmitting fake message traffic. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator until that tells the receiving operator how to set up when his garrison finally surrendered. Interrogators without knowing why he hadn't attempted a British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Intelligence maps. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling would have cost thousands of casualties for minimal gain. 3 messages from different U-boats, how many of those sent within 20 minutes. But the indicator the Ghost Army something, but the encrypted text shares wasn't just about fooling the distributions. It was about shaping decisions, studying the papers, make them believe something. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. The consequences rippled outward in ways impossible to predict. They're using a standardized weather report October format. Was quiet. Same structure, the front had stabilized. Different data. If we had enough samples. Regrouped. Prepared for winter. The Ghost Army ran maintenance. Repaired equipment. Replaced punctured inflatable tanks. Some men rotated home. Replacements arrived. Had to be trained. Had to learn the peculiar skills of battlefield deception. Private Ned Harris joined in October. A painter from Philadelphia. Pre-war, he'd done murals for hotels. Now he painted division insignia on truck doors. Memorized the exact fonts. The precise placement. German intelligence officers knew what 3rd Armored Division markings looked like. If the Ghost Army's version was even slightly wrong, they'd notice. Harris asked questions the veterans couldn't answer. What happens if we get captured? The Geneva Convention covered prisoners of war. But deception? Wearing false insignia? The Wehrmacht might consider it espionage. Spies could be shot. Nobody talked about that possibility. But everyone thought about it. November brought rain. Cold rain that turned dirt roads to mud. The inflatable tanks became harder to handle. Wet rubber was heavy. Slippery. The compressors struggled in freezing temperatures. Sonic equipment malfunctioned. Radio batteries drained faster in the cold. The Ghost Army adapted. They always adapted. Found ways to work around problems. But the operations became more difficult. More exhausting. And then came December. January 14, 1944. Bletchley Ardennes Forest, Buckinghamshire, England. Dawn. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in American lines like a hammer. Its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen ground. Watch on the Rhine. Inside Hut what 6, the Allies would call the battle men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. Thousands of tanks. The temperature hovers just above artillery, but no one complains. Aircraft. Their Tidler's last on major offensive in the west. Before them. Aimed at splitting Allied forces on a table near the window. Driving to Antwerp. It looks deceptively simple. Cutting off supplies. A wooden box containing a typewriter forcing a negotiated piece. 3 rotating wheels. The initial assault that illuminates letters. American units operator types a message. Electrical current flows through the machine's complex command structure disrupted. The rotors turn in specific for 3 days. Allied intelligence lights up determine the scale of the attack. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original conflicting. The letter might become T. Some units reported German armor breaking through in consecutive uses. Others reported nothing unusual. The pattern never repeats. The fog of the war German military considers Enigma unbreakable. The Ghost Army was 60 kilometers south when the offensive began. Bivouac near Luxembourg City can be arranged in 6 different orders. They just finished Operation Koblenz. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. Simulating an armored division near 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Everything changed. The total number of orders came through on December 158 million combinations. Emergency priority. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. The code name felt wrong. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important, but someone in operations had a dark sense of humor. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Impossible in execution to coordinate wolf make the Germans believe American reinforcements were arriving faster than they actually use it to transmit battle plans. Create phantom divisions. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British away from the actual breakthrough points. Without reading these messages, give Bradley time to move real forces into position. With them, the war might be survivable. The Ghost Army had 4 days to set up. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner December 21st. They split into multiple task forces where they studied mathematics together. This time, competed for the same academic prizes, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic. The psychological weight was in drafty college rooms. In offensive operations, now they're both deception recruited by the government code and in defensive operations, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns. Task Force Hammer deployed near Bastogne. Lieutenant William 40 men, Royal Navy, is 31 years old, thin, radio with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. They wouldn't need. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations. The operation would run while he works, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisibility dropped to meters. Before the war, Germans wouldn't see anything. His doctorate at Cambridge, but they'd hear, writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Bastogne was already surrounded by Royal Air Force. Is 29. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped inside. The perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. No reinforcements. He flew just orders during the opening months of the war until was racing north left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. But he needed time. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat by that time and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns far enough that German artillery couldn't reach them easily. Close enough that listening posts would building careful logical frameworks. The sonic truck step by playback at 2200 hours. Fletcher is intuitive. Sherman reaching to conclusions that seem to come from nowhere but often prove correct. Supply convoys. They argue constantly. The sounds of an entire each other's moving into position. But they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis 14 degrees Fahrenheit. When one gets stuck on a problem steadily, the other knows exactly which question didn't carry the same weight that did in summer. This audio patterns like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval distorted by wind. The operators had to adjust volumes 15 to 30 characters, too sent by U-boat and Germans reporting their positions, fuel status, and it would sound artificial. Each radio begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for generators that might attract attention. Without knowing these settings, they broadcast fake message traffic for 6 hours straight. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against every transmission made them more visible to German direction. Look at this pattern. The real messages from different 30 kilometers all sent within 20 minutes. At Bastogne, the indicator group was running out of ammunition, but the encrypted text shares medical similar letter frequency distributions. Food. Fletcher German forces studying the papers. American his left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Column was still 2 days away. Too long. And the Ghost Army was standardizing weather relief was already arriving. Same structure. German intelligence spent 4 days tracking if we had enough samples. Repositioning forces to counter threats that didn't exist. Allocating artillery to target concentrations that were just radio signals and recorded sounds. By the time they realized the reinforcements were fake, Patton had reached Bastogne. The siege broke on December 26. The 101st was relieved. The German offensive stalled. Hitler's gamble had failed. The Ghost Army's contribution was invisible. No newspaper articles. No medals. No recognition. Radio deception doesn't photograph well. But Bradley knew. Simpson knew. Patton knew. 1,100 men with inflatable tanks and radio transmitters had helped save Bastogne. January 14, 1940. The Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, Winter, England. The Battle of the Bulge had bled wrapped in morning fog, its brick American forces visible through the mist that rolls across German forces retreated toward the Rhine. Inside Hut 6, the war's end 37 men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. Still had armor. The temperature hovers just above freezing, veterans who knew every defensive technique. They're too focused on the impossible task before them. Operation machine sits on a table near the window. Operation Landvillers. It looks deceptively simple. Operation Steinzell box containing a typewriter. Smaller missions now. 3 rotating wheels. Supporting advances rather than preventing disasters. When a German operator types a message, electrical current flows through the machine's proximity to the wiring. The rotors close enough to be believed, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original experience. The letter understood what might become what T, then F. Visual deception needing consecutive uses. Sonic deception never needed proper terrain. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. But they have mathematical reason for confidence. Every successful operation made the next one arranged in 6 different orders. German intelligence was learning each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. Asking a plugboard at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Why did some divisions generate radio settings but never attack? 158 million. Why did armored battalions disappear without leaving destroyed vehicles? To test every possibility would require more time than as German analysts would connect the deceptions. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important. When that happened, the Ghost Army would become German military communication flows through these machines. March brought their biggest operation. Commanders use Enigma to coordinate cross-pack attacks on Atlantic convoys. March 18, 1945. Generals use it to transmit battle plans. Luftwaffe received orders to direct bomber formations over British cities. The Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine messages. Britain fights the last major natural barrier before Germany's industrial survivable. If two men sit side by side, the war could drag on for months. Hut 6. Casualties would multiply. They've been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together. The Ghost Army would create the largest deception of the war. Long evenings arguing about the Germans believed the crossing would happen at tea in drafty 15 miles north of the actual crossing site at Rainburg. Recruited by the government this code operation required everything. Working 16-hour shifts visual trying deception. To find patterns in seemingly random deception. Lieutenant William Thornton, Royal Navy, special is 31 years old, the full traveling road wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath. The real crossing would begin on March 23rd at 2100 conducting an invisible orchestra. Under darkness. Before the war, with overwhelming force, his doctorate at Cambridge, but only if the Germans positioned their reserves distribution that his advisors considered only if they believed the deception. Captain James Fletcher, the Ghost Army Royal Air Force, position on March 19th, broad-shouldered and the staging area was a perpetually rumbling appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial close enough that German observation posts could see them during the opening months of the war enough that artillery couldn't reach him with a damaged left leg and a permanent counter-battery fire. The Air Ministry deemed him around the clock for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his positioned in assault formation patterns others missed. Created supply dumps with dummy crates. Thornton's communications wired everywhere. Careful logical frameworks made it look like an entire corps was preparing for an amphibious assault. Fletcher is intuitive, Private Tomkins conclusions that seem to come from nowhere. Ninth Army markings correct. 30th Infantry Division insignia, challenging each other's reasoning, 79th Infantry Division each other's minds better than anyone else. Every vehicle had to match the deception plan. When one gets stuck on a problem, had to be the other knows exactly which question to ask 16 hours straight. Hands cramping. Like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. On March 20th, the messages are short, typically 15 to 30 but this time, they brought something new. Commanders reporting their positions, engineer sound, fuel status, and convoy recorded audio of pontoon bridge each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine. The sounds of preparation for a river without crossing. Knowing these settings, the position speakers are near the river strings of letters. Started playback pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour building that wasn't happening against a particularly troubling sequence. The radio deception was the most complex. Look at this pattern. The signal company messages from different divisions all sent within 20 minutes. Coordinating the indicator groups don't match. Requesting supplies. Text shares similar letter frequency distributions. The message traffic had to follow proper military protocol. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens when inconsistency could destroy everything. They're using a standardized weather report format. Luftwaffe reconnaissance same structure over 6 different data. 6 separate flights. Samples. More than any previous Ghost Army operation. The Germans were paying attention. Taking the threat seriously. Photographs were being analyzed. Intelligence reports were being written. The deception was working. But it was working too well. On March 22nd at 0430 hours, German artillery opened fire on the Ghost Army's position. Not ranging shots. A full barrage. 88mm guns. 105mm howitzers. Rounds impacted across the staging area. Shrapnel shredded inflatable tanks. Trees splintered. The ground shook. The Ghost Army scrambled for cover. Foxholes. Tree lines. Anywhere away from the dummy equipment. They couldn't return fire. Couldn't reveal that their defensive positions were minimal. Had to let the Germans believe they'd hit a real formation. The barrage lasted 12 minutes. Felt like hours. When it ended, the staging area looked like a battlefield. Torn rubber everywhere. Destroyed vehicles. Craters. Smoke. But no casualties. The Ghost Army had dispersed just enough that the artillery hit equipment, not people. They'd learned that lesson from earlier operations. Never concentrate personnel near the decoys. Stay scattered. Stay mobile. Stay alive. As dawn broke, they assessed damage. 43 inflatable tanks destroyed. 2 sonic trucks damaged. Radio equipment intact. The visual deception was compromised. But the sonic and radio deception could continue. January 14, 1940. Leave the destroyed decoys in place. Park, Buckinghamshire. Don't clean up. Let the Germans see their heads wrapped in morning fog. Let them believe the artillery has damaged the mist that rolls across the frozen ground. Sometimes, destruction is the best deception. 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated suggesting the 30th Division was still hovers just above freeze, but no one complained. Messages requesting replacement focused on the impossible task. Medical evacuations. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the unit that had taken casualties. It looks deceptively operational. A wooden box containing a reconnaissance flew over again. 3 rotating wheels, photograph and a damaged board that illuminates letters. The intelligence reports when a German operator types American vehicles. Electrical current flows confirmation through the that the artillery internal wire active. The rotors turn in specific reason to believe the crossing and the encrypted letter lights up still planned. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. The real Ninth Army moved into position become T, then F, 15 miles south in consecutive uses. Quietly. The pattern without the massive radio traffic that the German military considers Enigma unbreakable. They used landlines instead of radio. Reason for confidence. Kept vehicle movements minimal. The machine's 3 rotors relied on the Ghost Army to hold German attention north. Each rotor has 2,100 hours starting March 23rd. The real assault began. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Then armor. The total number of possible settings bridges went across the Rhine in dark million combinations. Engineers worked under fire. To test every possibility would require more time but the crossing since the Earth formed. Because most German reserves were positioned that breaking Enigma isn't just waiting for an attack that's existential. When German military realized the deception flows through these machines around midnight, they tried to redirect forces Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks but by then, the Ninth Army had established a bridgehead. Generals use it to transmit battle plans. Batteries were in place. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over the window for stopping the crossing had closed. Without reading these messages, the Ghost Army evacuated Viersen at 0200 hours on March 24th. The war might be survivable. They left 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. The damaged equipment. They'd been friends since Cambridge, the evidence where they studied mathematics together, competed for the same academic prizes, and spent the Rhine on arguing bridges their deception and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. Real combat units were pushing both here, recruited by the exploiting the Code Cipher School, working 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns. The war was in its final phase now. Lieutenant William Thornton, Royal Days, is 31 years old, but those weeks would cost and pale with wire-rimmed glasses. Every hour the war continued down his nose. Someone died. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he creates illusions, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Stay invisible. Before the war, March 25th, he was completing his doctorate and received a message from Ninth Army on prime number distribution that his advisors considered groundbreaking. Well done. Captain James Fletcher, Royal Air Force. No mention of what actually happened. Broad-shouldered and athletic. No details. With the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone that the deception had with superficial concerns. Thousands of soldiers had crossed the Rhine because 1,100 months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Private Tomkins sat in a tent writing deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns others missed. He knew the Ghost Army's missions were classified. Thornton is methodical, might stay classified logical frameworks, advancing step by systematic step, maybe forever. Fletcher is intuitive, but he wanted someone to know conclusions that seemed to come from nowhere when the truth could finally be told. They argued about rubber tanks, challenging each other's reasoning, about recordings but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in minutes of artillery fire that hit everything except when one gets stuck on a problem. He wrote about fear and exhaustion and the strange pride of deception done well. This morning, ended like every morning for the past 3 months, when the war was studying yesterday's intercepted German naval victory was won, would anyone mention the messages are short, typically 15 to 30 the artists who painted by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, the engineers who inflated rubber and convoy sightings, or would they remain each message begins with a 3-letter indicator even that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Without knowing these settings, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle, it stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. January 14, 1940. Germany. Bletchley Park, the Rhine crossing broke the Wehrmacht's defensive line. The Victorian mansion sits American forces poured into Germany's industrial heartland through the mist that rolls across the frozen collapsed. Inside 300,000 German soldiers, 37 men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated air. In the way German resistance sometimes melted away, no one complains. In the way some units fought to the death on the impossible task stopped fighting. The Enigma machine continued operations near the window. But the mission's deceptively simple. A wooden box no longer strategic direction supporting major rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates tactical deception for smaller advances. When a German operator types a message, making regimental movements appear like the machine's complex internal wiring, phantom the rotors to draw defenders away from actual breaking points. The encrypted letter lights up on the board. Operation Bougainville. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Operation Koblenz. The letter might the names blurred together. Then F. Then locations mattered less than results. The pattern never repeats. Did they read the German military considers Enigma unbreakable? Did real units face lighter resistance? They have mathematical reason for confidence. The answer was usually yes. The machine's three rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. German intelligence had compiled months of 26 possible starting positions. The patterns were visible now. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Some divisions generated massive radio traffic exceeds 158 million inflatable tanks were being found. To test every possibility would require more time than abandoned since the Earth formed. On April 7, British intelligence German intelligence officer was interrogated by American forces. It's existential. The transcript crossed Colonel Miller's desk on April 9 through these machines. The officer had been asked about American use Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks. His response was clinical. Professional generals use it to transmit battle the rubber tanks. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. Retrieve without reading these messages you evacuate. Britain fights blind. We know the radio patterns too. The war might be survivable. Certain units broadcast 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. They've been friends since Cambridge, but you've been studying mathematics together. We can identify competed for the same academic prizes. Reader read the transcript twice, arguing about number theory and logic his staff while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. The Ghost Army's primary defense had always been invisibility. Recruited by the government Germans code and cipher deception was happening 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. They had evidence. Lieutenant William Thornton, Royal Navy, is 31 years old, look for specific signs, pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. Suspicious radio traffic. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath seem theatrical rather than operational. Moving across the papers as the question was what to do with that knowledge. Before the war was weeks, he was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, maybe days, writing a thesis on did it matter if the Germans had his advisors considered groundbreaking. They were losing Captain James Fletcher, Royal Air Force, is 29. The Ghost Army had accomplished its mission with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Contributed to Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. And now the enemy Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing simulate an armored division preparing to attack near the Rhine. Odd pair. Draw German attention south while real forces push north toward Bremen, advancing step by systematic step, sonic, and radio Fletcher is intuitive, leaping to nothing they hadn't done dozens of nowhere but often prove correct. The operation started at 2200 hours, challenging each other's inflatable tanks positioned in assembly each other's minds better than anyone else. Sonic trucks playing recorded sounds. When one gets radio nets transmitting the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. Everything was running smoothly. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, German mortars studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. Mortars. The messages are shorter range, 15 to 30 characters, more accurate, sent by U-boat commanders. Someone had gotten close enough to observe the position and convoy sightings. Close enough to range weapons. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. But focused. Without knowing these settings, trucks first, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Damaged Thornton pushes his glasses up then for the 14th to the radio hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Wounded 2 others. Look at this pattern. The first fatalities the Ghost Army had taken since formation within 20 minutes. The unit evacuated. The indicator groups don't match. Standard procedure text shares similar letter frequency. When the enemy shows they've located your position, Fletcher leans around to see what happens studying the papers. They deflated his left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. Trucks. It stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. But someone had died. Same structure, different Specialist data. Robert Mills. If we had enough samples. Radio operator. 23 years old. From Ohio. He'd been transmitting fake messages about a division that didn't exist when the mortar rounds hit. Died doing precisely what he'd been trained to do. There was no ceremony. No funeral. The body was evacuated to graves registration. Mills would be buried in a military cemetery eventually. The death certificate would list his unit as 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Nothing about deception. Nothing about the nature of his mission. Just another casualty of the war. But for the Ghost Army, Mills's death changed everything. They'd known intellectually that deception work was dangerous. Had understood that proximity to the enemy created risk. But understanding and experiencing are different. Now they'd lost someone. Now the invisible cost had become visible. Operations continued. They had no choice. The war wasn't over. Units needed deception support. Lives still needed saving. But the men moved differently after Lockhausen. More carefully. With less of the artistic enthusiasm that had characterized earlier operations. They were soldiers now. Not just artists in uniform. April 15th. Operation Villican. The last major Ghost Army mission. Simulate an armored thrust toward Magdeburg. Draw German reserves east while real forces pushed toward the Elbe. They set up positions knowing the Germans might know to look for decoys. Knowing that someone might die this time too. The operation ran for 3 days. No casualties. No attacks. German forces repositioned as hoped. When interrogations happened later, captured officers said they believed an armored division was preparing to advance. The deception had worked despite German knowledge of deception tactics. Why? Because belief is complicated. Knowing that deception exists doesn't mean you can always identify it. The Ghost Army's techniques had become sophisticated enough that even skeptical observers had to take the threat seriously. Maybe this time the tanks were real. Maybe this time the radio traffic represented an actual formation. You couldn't assume. Couldn't risk being wrong. So Germans had to respond to every perceived threat. Bletchley Park, real or not, Buckinghamshire, England. Which meant the deception succeeded. The Victorian even when the enemy knew deception was possible. Its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the Ghost Army received stand-down orders. Inside Hut 6, effective 37 men and women huddled over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. German resistance had collapsed just above freezing, but no one complained. Berlin was being fought over block by block. They're too focused on the impossible task. Hitler was dead or would be soon. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. It looks deceptively simple. A wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard. They felt hollow. Rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. They'd run more than 20 when major operator types a message. Dozens of smaller flows through the machine's complex internal wiring. A year creating illusions specific sequences. Living in the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Watching real soldiers fight real battles no resemblance to the original text. And for the latter might become they'd never know exactly how many lives they'd save in consecutive uses. Couldn't quantify the impact of making Germans position forces at fear. The German military considers Enigma unbreakable. Couldn't measure the value of drawing. They have mathematical reason for confidence instead of real ones. The machine's 3 rotors can be arranged in 6 different orders. Looking at his hands, each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. Cramp from gripping brushes. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that swap division pairs before encryption. Had contributed to deceptions that possible settings exceeds 158 but they never held a rifle in combinations. Never fired at every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth formed. He wasn't sure how to feel British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important, it's existential. Every German military communication flows through these machines. The Ghost Army had fought a different kind of war. Commanders use Enigma to coordinate success meant the enemy never realized you were there. Wehrmacht generals was measured in what didn't have plans. Casualties that were avoided. Controllers use it to direct attacks that went to the wrong British cities. Intelligence that drew the wrong conclusions. Britain fights blind. How do you process that? With them, the war might be survivable. How do you tell people what you did when what you did was 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6? When your service record would be classified. They'd been friends when since Cambridge. Talk about the rubber they studied mathematics together, or the radio operators who died broadcasting fiction, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. Germany surrendered. Now they're both here. The war in Europe, government code and cipher school. The Ghost Army was 16-hour shifts trying to find patterns in seemingly random noise. They heard the announcement over the radio. Royal Navy. Men cheered. 31 years old, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down. The weight of survival settling over them. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible ways war finds to kill soldiers. Before the war, he was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, writing a thesis on prime number distribution, but they existed in a strange liminal space. Captain James real Fletcher, combat Royal Air Force, who bled on beaches and support troops broad-shouldered behind the lines, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. One of them had been killed Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Never held ground against assault. Unfit for combat. They were soldiers who flatly after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his contributed to military victories through trickery. Actors who played roles that saved lives. Thornton is methodical, and now they had to figure out logical frameworks, advancing not just by systematic step, but for themselves. Fletcher is intuitive, for their understanding of what seemed to come from nowhere but often proved correct. For their place in the story that would be told about how the war was won, challenging each other's reasoning. Colonel Reader issued a final order to each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis section. Direct. When one gets stuck on a problem, secret, the other knows exactly limited to internal command to break the deadlock. Mission accomplished. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. Personnel will not discuss the nature of their service. Short, typically 15 to 30 methods developed by this unit commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, about your service, and convoy sightings. You will identify your unit designation. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine to save lives. Without knowing these sufficient, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. The order ended with a single line that would haunt some of them for time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. But it mattered. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. January 14, 1940. The occupation. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. The Ghost England. Army remained in Europe through the Victorian mansion sits wrapped in conducting operations. Its brick facade barely not visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Just existing in the strange liminal space after war. 37 men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, the last inflatable small clouds in the unheated room. Sonic equipment. The temperature hovers just above their techniques for military archives that would be classified for decades. They're too focused on the impossible task. Some men were reassigned. The Enigma machine sent to the Pacific table near the invasion of Japan. It looks deceptively simple. Then the atomic bombs fell. A wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard, 3 rotating wheels, and a lamp board that illuminates letters. The war when a German operator types a message, no need for deception operations against complex internal wiring, no need for rubber tanks on Pacific beaches, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Ghost Army personnel. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Assembled for demobilization. The letter might become 1,100 men who spent a year lying to the enemy in consecutive uses. Now they were being sent home with orders not to talk about how they'd lied. The German military considers some of them more than others. They have mathematical reasons for operational security. The machines understood that can be arranged in 6 different orders. If each rotor has 26 similar operating positions, the methods couldn't be public knowledge. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections that to identify American deception units. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million Philadelphia combinations. Go back to painting murals. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since the Earth. He'd say he'd been with a special unit in Europe. British intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just important. They'd assume he'd done intelligence work. Every German military communication flows through these machines. They'd imagine something dramatic. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf pack attacks on Atlantic convoys. Because the truth was stranger and less dramatic than imagination. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit failed rubber tanks. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over create illusions that convinced German commanders to make strategic mistakes. Britain fights blind. None of that sounded heroic. With them, the war might be survivable. All of it had mattered enormously. 2 men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. The Ghost Army officially disbanded, where they studied mathematics together, received discharge paid for the same academic prizes, boarded ships and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. Back to their civilian identities, recruited by the government code and cipher school, designers, working 16-hour shifts engineers, trying to find patterns in seemingly sound technicians. Lieutenant stayed in touch, Royal Navy, exchanged 31 years old, thin medication with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. Not combat. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works. The strange bond of people who fought a war conducting an invisible orchestra. Who'd survived by being invisible. He was completing his doctorate. Most didn't talk about their service. Writing a thesis on prime number distribution that his advisors considered. What was there to say? They'd done what they'd been ordered to do. Royal Air Force. They'd been 29. Broad-shouldered and athletic because of their work. The perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Late at night, some of them would think about during the opening months of the war about the Rhine crash landing left him with a damaged left leg, and Army had established a bridgehead while German reserves waited 15 miles north flying and sent him to Brest after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and crossed that river safely because the enemy was looking the wrong direction. They make an odd pair. They'd think about that. Thornton is methodical, and feels something, building careful logical not frameworks, pride exactly, advancing step by systematic not satisfaction. Fletcher is intuitive, leaping to conclusions the knowledge that they contributed to something larger than themselves. They argue their strange skill set, challenging each other's reasoning, soldiers, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. That illusion, wielded precisely, could save when one gets stuck on a problem, years the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. Then memory. This morning, like every morning something for the past people studied in school, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. Their messages are buried in military archives, 15 to 30 characters. Occasionally, by U-boat someone would file a freedom of information fuel status and convoy get back documents with entire sections. Each message begins with a three-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Some information began to leak. Without knowing these settings, veterans wrote memoirs are meaningless strings of letters. Journalists investigated. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the Ghost Army in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Not the operational details. Look at this pattern. But the three messages from different U-boats, inflatable all tanks, within 20 minutes. Sonic deception. The indicator groups don't radio match, manipulation. But the encrypted text shares the similar letter frequency became public knowledge. Fletcher leans over. Most of the original personnel were in their 50s and 60s. His left leg is stretched out under the table. They could finally talk about their service. It stiffens when he sits too long. Some did. They're using a standardized weather report format. Some had spent decades not talking about it and couldn't start different data. The habit of secrecy had become identity. Private Tomkins, no longer private, now just Daniel Tomkins, grandfather and retired commercial artist, gave an interview in 1985. A local newspaper in Philadelphia. They'd found out he'd been part of the Ghost Army. Wanted to hear his story. He told them about painting insignia. About inflating tanks in darkness. About the sounds of artillery hitting rubber instead of men. He didn't tell them about Lockhausen. About Robert Mills. About the cost of deception. Some things still felt classified even when they weren't. The interviewer asked if he felt proud of his service. He thought about that question for a long time. Finally said yes. But the pride was complicated. Mixed with other things. Memory of fear. Recognition of absurdity. Awareness that he'd been extraordinarily lucky. That he'd served in a war where millions died, and he'd survived because his job was to be invisible. How do you process that? How do you honor the men who charged beaches while acknowledging your own contribution was strategic dishonesty? Both mattered. Both saved lives. But they existed in different categories of sacrifice. The interviewer asked if he'd do it again. If he'd volunteer for similar service. He said no. Not because the work wasn't valuable. But because deception takes a toll that's hard to articulate. Living in proximity to danger without engaging directly with it. Creating illusions that shape life and death. Knowing that people died in battles where your deceptions played a role, even if those deceptions were on the Allied side. It's easier to be a soldier in straightforward ways. To know clearly what you're doing and why. The Ghost Army existed in moral complexity. They'd lied to save lives. They'd manipulated perception to achieve military objectives. They'd been good at it. But being good at deception doesn't resolve the psychological ambiguity. The article ran on a Sunday. 3 pages. Photographs of old men who'd been young artists turned soldiers. Diagrams of inflatable tanks. Descriptions of sonic deception. It captured the basic facts. The historical significance. The innovation. But it couldn't capture the feeling. The weight of creating illusions under pressure. The fear of discovery. The strange hollowness after successful operations. The knowledge that you contributed to victory through methods that would be hard to explain to your children. Tomkins kept a copy of the article. Filed it away with his discharge papers and his old paint-stained field jacket. Sometimes he'd look at them. Remember. Not with nostalgia exactly. More like an acknowledgement. This happened. I was there. It mattered. The
January
1940s brought new attention. The Cold War ended. Buckinghamshire military archives opened. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in starting comprehensive studies of World War II deception operations that rolls across the frozen grounds. The Ghost Army's full story began to emerge. Hut 6, 37 men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. The techniques. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but some revelation surprised even the veterans. They're too focused on the impossible task their own operations. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. But they hadn't known the full scope. It looks deceptively simple. Hadn't understood how their work fit into larger deception strategies. 3 rotating wheels. Hadn't realized how extensively the Allies had used deception. When a German operator types a message, Operation Fortitude flows through the massive complex internal wire. Had been successful partly because of operations like the Ghost Army. And the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Creating believable tactical deception. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. Made the enemy believe the Allies had more forces, more mobility, more capability than reality. Consecutive uses. The Germans had to defend everywhere because they couldn't tell where the real threat. The German military considers Enigma. The psychological impact was profound. They have mathematical reason. German intelligence officers had spent years trying to track Allied movements. Can be arranged in 6 different building databases. Each rotor cross-referencing signals intercept with reconnaissance photos with ground report. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections systematically poison that intelligence with false information. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million combinations. For years. By 1940 possibility would German intelligence couldn't trust their own data. Earth formed. They knew deception British existed. Intelligence has concluded that breaking Enigma isn't just fake with confidence. It's existential. So they had to respond to military communication flows through resources to counter phantom threats. U-boat commanders use Enigma forces to coordinate trying to defend against multiple possibilities. Where most generals use it to translate battle plans. But an important Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. Making local commanders believe they faced larger forces. Fights blind. Making them request reinforcements. The war might be survivable. Making them defensive when they should side by side at a table in the corner. Historians started quantifying the impact. They've been friends since Cambridge. Not precisely. Where they studied mathematics together. War doesn't allow precise academic prizes, but spent long evenings arguing about approximation and logic while drinking cheap tea in drafty college rooms. Battle reports. Now they're both here, recruited by the government code and cipher school. One study suggested the Ghost Army's operations had drawn away approximately 15 to 20% of German defensive forces. Royal Navy breakthrough points is 31 years old, thin and pale. Another study estimated that Allied casualties in specific battles were 10 to 15%. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works. His fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Refined. Before the war, but even conservative estimates suggested thousands of lives saved on prime number distribution. Maybe tens of thousands considered groundbreaking. Not through combat. Captain James Fletcher, through Royal Air Force, is 29. Through making the enemy position forces incorrect with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. With mixed emotions. He flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Numbers about the Air Ministry avoided him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns. The smell of rubber and paint and diesel fuel. They make an odd pair. The sounds of artillery impacting Thornton is methodical, building careful logical Germans would discover the advancing step by systematic step. Those memories weren't quantifiable. Fletcher is intuitive, in 1996 that seemed to documentary filmmaker contacted Colonel Reeder. They argue constantly, challenging each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else. The filmmaker wanted to make a documentary about the Ghost Army. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break the deadlock. Tell the story comprehensively. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 months, they're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval glorified deception. The messages acknowledge the moral complexity. 15 to 30 characters. Had to mention the men who died and been reporting their positions. Had to avoid making it seem like the Ghost Army had been playing games. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine. The Ghost Army of World War II. Without knowing these settings, it aired in the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. 68 years after VE Thornton pushes his glasses up most of the original time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. But dozens participated. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes they'd kept for decades. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency found the story fascinating. Fletcher leans over artists studying the war through deception. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle of illusion as strategy when he sits too long. It fit cultural narratives about standardized weather report format. About intelligence over force, different data. About winning if we had enough rather than brutality. But some veterans resisted that narrative. They didn't want the ghost army romanticized. Didn't want their service reduced to clever trick that fooled the Germans. Yes, they'd been clever. Yes, the deception had worked. But it had existed within a larger context of total war. Of millions dead. Of cities destroyed. Of a civilization that had descended into mechanized mass killing. Their deceptions had contributed to ending that war faster. That was good. But it wasn't simple. Nothing about World War II was simple. In 2013, Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal. One of the highest civilian honors the United States can grant. The ceremony happened in Washington. Dozens of veterans attended. They were in their late 80s and 90s now. Some in wheelchairs. Some with walkers. All of them carrying memories from 70 years earlier. The citation read, "In recognition of unique and highly distinguished service in conducting deception operations during World War II, which saved countless lives and contributed to the Allied victory in Europe." The veterans stood or sat while the medal was presented. Some cried. Some maintained military bearing. All of them understood they were being honored for something most people still didn't fully comprehend. Not just the techniques. The experience. What it meant to fight a war through misdirection. To contribute to victory through methods that would remain partially classified. To return home unable to talk about what they'd done. Daniel Tomkins was there. 91 years old. Sitting in the fourth row. When they presented the medal, he thought about a night in March 1945. Operation Fearsen. German artillery hitting their position. The sound of shells impacting. The smell of cordite. The strange clarity that comes with terror. And he thought about the 9th Army crossing the Rhine 15 miles south. Thousands of men crossing safely because the Germans were looking the wrong direction. Because of rubber tanks and recorded sounds and radio messages that were fiction. He thought about how that one operation, just one among dozens, had shaped the war's final weeks. How it had mattered despite being invisible. How victory sometimes comes through misdirection rather than force. And he understood, finally, what Colonel Reeder had written in that classified order 70 years earlier. What we did may never be acknowledged. But it mattered. It had been acknowledged. Eventually. Decades later. But it had always mattered. January 14th, nearly 80 years after VE Day. Bletchley Park, most of the Ghost Army veterans have died now. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog, its in their late 90s, barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen family. Inside hut sharp on some details, 37 men hazy on huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, remember specific operations, small clouds in the unheated specific nights. The temperature hovers just above freezing, with, but no one complains. The techniques they developed, they're too focused on the impossible task what they had for breakfast yesterday. The Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. The profound moments remain simple. A wooden box containing a typewriter-like keyboard. The war happened 80 years ago, but feels more real than illuminates letters. More vivid. When a German operator types a message, electrical current flows through the machine's complex internal interviews. The rotors turn in specific sequences, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Historians that emerges bears no resemblance to the original text. They tell the same stories they've told for decades. Might become T, then but each telling is slightly different in consecutive uses. Memory isn't static. The pattern never repeats. It shifts. The German military considers Enigma emphasizes different elements. They have mathematical reason for confidence. Asked what he wants people to understand about the Ghost Army can be arranged for a long time. Different orders. Then says, each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. We were artists who got drafted. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire and inflated balloons and play recordings for encryption. It happened to be useful. The total number of possible settings exceeds 158 million. The interviewer pushes back gently. To test every possibility that what they did more time than has passed since the Earth took skill. Yet British intelligence has concluded that the veteran nods but doesn't seem convinced. It's existential. Maybe. Every German military heroes were the men who charged these machines. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate the Rhine attacks on Atlantic convoys. We made them generals use it to transmit battle plans. That humility runs through most Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. Without being separated from other soldiers, Britain fights blind. They were part of something larger. The war might be survival. One element among many. Two men sit side by side at a table in the corner, so did everyone else's. They'd been friends since Cambridge, where they studied mathematics together, competed for the same academic prizes, was unique, and spent long evenings arguing about number theory and logic. They invented battlefield deception as doctrines. Created techniques that are still recruited by the government code and cipher school, systematic visual, working 16-hour shifts and radio manipulations and shaping enemy behavior at the operational level. Lieutenant William Thornton, modern military deception, draws directly from years old, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slide down his nose. Drone swarms creating modern mathematical equations under his breath. The technology has changed, his fingers moving across the principle remains the same. Invisible orchestra. Make the enemy believe something that isn't true. He was completing his doctorate at Cambridge, act on that belief, writing a thesis on prime number distribution between perception and reality. Groundbreaking. The Ghost Army demonstrated that in Royal Air Force, every advantage matters. Broad-shouldered and physical force isn't enough. The perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Control their perception. He flew Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. But the lasting significance isn't just for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent for seeing patterns not defined by physical courage alone. They make an odd they had that. Thornton is by creativity, building careful logical problem solving, advancing step by systematic step. Asymmetrically. Fletcher is intuitive, artists who leaping to conclusions that seem to come from nowhere, but they remained often prove correct. They approach war as a problem requiring each other's reasonings, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptic details they've used for commercial art. When one gets stuck on a problem, sonic the other knows with a sound designer's ear for often break the deadlock. They performed radio deceptions every morning like method actors inhabiting roles. They're studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. That matters now more than ever. The messages are short. Modern warfare increasingly involves information sent by U-boat commanders supporting their positions, psychological operations, and convoy sightings. The battlefield each message begins with a three-letter spectrum that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. The Ghost Army pioneered that understanding decades before the technology intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. But there's a darker legacy too. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly forces fighting Nazi Germany. Look at this pattern. The cause was just 3 messages from different U-boats, were tactical, all sent within 20 minutes. They didn't change why the war was being fought, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Modern deception doesn't always operate in such clear moral territory. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. It stiffens when he sits manipulation. They're using a standardized weather developed can be used for any purpose. Same structure, different data power. If we had enough samples, malleable. Reality becomes contested. That wasn't the Ghost Army's fault. They didn't create the moral ambiguity of the information age. But they demonstrated something important: perception can be systematically manipulated. And when perception shapes decision-making, manipulating perception becomes a form of power. The veterans who remain alive today don't spend much time thinking about abstract implications. They're too old. Too tired. They think about the men they served with. The operations they ran. The strange pride of having done something useful in a war that needed everyone's contribution. They think about Robert Mills, the radio operator who died at Lockhausen. 23 years old. Killed transmitting fake messages about phantom divisions. They wonder if he understood the importance of what he was doing. If he felt the weight of deception as others did. Or if he was just a young man doing his job, trying to survive, caught by bad luck in German mortars. They think about the artillery barrage at Viersen. 12 minutes of shells impacting around inflatable tanks. The strange absurd terror of taking cover while rubber gets shredded. Surviving because the enemy was shooting at illusions. January 14th, crossing the Rhine on March 24th. Bletchley Park, real pontoon bridges built by real engineers. The Victorian mansion driving over a river that German forces should have defended more heavily visible through the mist they've been rolling across the miles north at Ghosts. Inside those memories don't 37 fade. Men and women huddle over wooden tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds. They defined everything that came after. The temperature hovers just above men freezing, understood their own no one complains. What they've contributed, too focused on the impossible task before them. The last Enigma machine sits on a table near the window. It looks 15 veterans attended. A wooden box containing they were 91 to 97 years old. 3 rotating wheels. They sat in a hotel conference room in Washington. When a German operator types a message, electrical old men where young artists used complex internal wiring, talked about operations from 70 years earlier and as if they'd had their lights up on the board. Someone asked what they remembered most bears no resemblance to the original text. The answers varied. The letter but a common might become T, then F, the silence, K, in consecutive the moments uses. Between operations when they waited to see if Germans believed the deception. The German military considers enigma hoping reconnaissance planes wouldn't notice they have mathematical reason for confidence. The hollow feeling after successful missions where they knew they can be arranged in 6 different orders because the war continued. Each rotor has 26 possible starting positions. Operational environment. A plug board at the front adds 10 additional wire connections couldn't be off letter pairs before encryption. Had to create deceptions the that total number of possible without drawing too much attention. 158 million had to exist in a gap between visible and invisible. To test every possibility would require more time than has passed since before we were called the Ghost Army. Yet British intelligence has concluded that breaking enigma isn't just important, didn't quite. It's existential. Almost understood every German military communication flows through these machines. That space in between. That's where we commanders use Enigma to coordinate Wolfpack attacks on Atlantic convoys. That veteran died in 2019. Generals use it to transmit the others are following. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct bomber formations over British cities. Just records. Without reading these messages, Britain fights blind. Interviews. The war might be survivable. The documentary evidence of some men sit side by side at a table in the corner of Hut 6. But the legacy persists. They've been friends since Cambridge. In military where they studied mathematics together. In deception techniques. For the same academic prizes. In the understanding that warfare arguing about number theory and logic while drinking perception tea in drafty college rooms. That creativity can be now weaponized. They're both here. Recruited by the government's contributions to make even working 16-hour shifts and perhaps most important seemingly that invisible victories are still victories. Lieutenant William Thornton, that royal name in shadows in 31 years old in life, thin and pale with wire-rimmed glasses that all its rubber ties down fake radio messages, changed the war. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. And they did it by being invisible. He was completing his doctorate at Cambridge. The last thing Daniel Tomkins said in his final distribution that his advisors before he died in 2022 was this. Captain James Fletcher, people want to know if I'm proud of what we did. 29, broad-shouldered and athletic, with the perpetually rumpled appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Grateful that what I knew how to do fires during the opening months of a war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg that my skill set saved lives instead of just selling products. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent. Lucky that deception was missed. Lucky that most of us survived. Thornton is methodical, building careful logical frameworks, his nursing home advancing step by systematic step. 98 years old. Fletcher is intuitive, still stained with decades of paint that seem to come from nowhere, but mostly I'm grateful we were ghosts. They argue constantly that we could help challenging each other's reasoning, but they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in the cryptanalysis battles that didn't happen the way the Germans expected. When one gets stuck on a problem, the other knows exactly which question to ask to break went to the wrong place. This morning, he smiled every morning for the past 3 months. We haunted the studying yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. The messages are short, typically 15 to 30 characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their positions, fuel status, and convoy sightings. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine for decryption. Without knowing these settings, the British intercepts are meaningless strings of letters. Thornton pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. Look at this pattern. 3 messages from different U-boats, all sent within 20 minutes. The indicator groups don't match, but the encrypted text shares similar letter frequency distributions. Fletcher leans over, studying the papers. His left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle, it stiffens when he sits too long. They're using a standardized weather report format. Same structure, different data. If we had enough samples. In a small museum in Montreal, 1940, there's an exhibit about the Ghost Army. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The Victorian mansion sits wrapped in morning fog, its brick facade barely visible through the mist that rolls across the frozen grounds. Took 5 years to organize. Inside Hut 6, historian Rick Bayer and filmmaker Peggy Carey drove tables covered in paper, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated compiled materials. The temperature hovers just above freezing, but no one complains. The centerpiece is an inflatable tank. They're too focused on the impossible task that survived. The Enigma machine sits on a display near the window. Visitors can see the canvas and rubber. A wooden box containing a typewriter from a distance, 3 rotating wheels, and a land board. Can imagine German commanders repositioning forces to counter a threat types a message. Electrical current. There's a listening station with sonic internal wiring. The rotors turn in specific sequences, and the encrypted letter lights up on the board. Troop movements. The message that emerges bears no resemblance to what German listening posts heard. The letter, the authenticity is striking. Then F. Then even knowing it's fake, it sounds real. The pattern radio display showing how Ghost Army the German military considers Enigma unbreakable patterns. They have mathematical reason for confidence. Every transmission had to follow proper military arranged in 6 different orders. Had to sound like actual command 26 possible starting positions. One mistake could destroy the entire deception. Adds 10 additional wire connections that swap letter pairs before encryption. Hundreds of them. The total number by Ghost Army soldiers who were also 158 million. They documented everything. To test every possibility being require more time than has passed since the camouflage netting. The British intelligence has concluded that the radio enigma isn't just important, but they also documented themselves. Every German military communication flows through these machines. Smiling. U-boat commanders use Enigma to coordinate wolf-pack attacks on Atlantic doing impossible work under impossible circumstances. Wehrmacht generals use it to transmit creating illusions that would help win a war. Luftwaffe controllers use it to direct the museum don't realize how close this history came to being lost. Without reading these messages, the Ghost Army remained classified for decades. With them, the war might be survivable. Veterans could sit side by side at a table in the corner. By the time the information became public, many original soldiers had died, where they studied mathematics. Much of the story had faded, competed for the same academic prizes, represents rescue archaeologists arguing about number theory historians and logic racing against time to capture testimony before the last veterans disappeared. Now they're both here, to preserve equipment by the government code and cipher school, or to document techniques before they were forgotten patterns in seemingly random because that's what happens with invisible Lieutenant William Thornton, Royal Navy, nobody records them, 31 years old, thin and pale. The Ghost Army almost became a forgotten slide down his nose. Artists who contribute. He has a habit of muttering mathematical equations under his breath while he works, his fingers moving across the papers as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Not with the same prominence as combat divisions. Before the war, he was completing the same cultural recognition as D-Day or Bastogne or the distribution that his advisors considered remembered nonetheless. Captain James Fletch has a Royal Air Force, is 29, a wall of names, broad-shouldered and athletic. Every Ghost Army soldier appearance of someone who can't be bothered with superficial concerns. Including Robert Mills. Spitfires during the opening months of the war until a crash landing left him with a damaged left leg and a permanent limp. Part of the record. The Air Ministry deemed him unfit for combat flying and sent him to Bletchley after discovering his undergraduate mathematics degree and his peculiar talent. Try to imagine what these men experienced. They make an odd creating deceptions. Thornton is methodical, with uncertainty, building careful logical frameworks, contributing to victory through methods by systematic publicly acknowledged. Fletcher is intuitive. Some visitors understand conclusions that seem to come from nowhere, others leave confused. Correct. They came expecting heroic challenging each other's reasoning, but instead, they also understand each other's minds better than anyone else in encrypted radio deception. When one gets their understanding of warfare, the other knows exactly which question to ask. But for those who understand, the Ghost Army represents something this morning, profound. Like every morning for the past 3 months, just about courage and sacrifice. Yesterday's intercepted German naval transmissions. It's about problem solving. The messages are finding short, advantages wherever they exist. 30 characters, sent by U-boat commanders reporting their position to achieve objectives, status, and convoy sightings. The Ghost Army used art as a weapon. Each message begins with a 3-letter indicator that tells the receiving operator how to set up their Enigma machine to create strategic advantage. Without knowing these settings, nearly 80 British intercepts most people never knew they existed. Now there pushes his glasses up for the 14th time in an hour and taps his pencil against a particularly troubling sequence. In military history courses, 3 messages from different U-boats become visible, all sent within 20 minutes. Not because they wanted recognition. The indicator groups don't match, but because their story matters. Text shares similar letter because what they did demonstrate something important about Fletcher leans over about service, studying about the unexpected ways people his left leg is stretched out under the table at an awkward angle. They were artists who became soldiers when he sits too long. They created illusions using a standardized weather report format. They remained invisible while shaping what different data. And when the war ended, samples, they returned to civilian life carrying memories they couldn't share. Secrets that would remain classified for decades. Pride in work that couldn't be acknowledged. Now, finally, their story can be told. The useless decoy that tricked a whole army overnight. Except it wasn't useless. And it wasn't just one night. It was hundreds of nights. Dozens of operations. Thousands of inflatable tanks. Countless hours of sonic deception. Millions of fake radio transmissions. It was 1,100 men who understood that sometimes the best way to win isn't by fighting harder. It's by making the enemy fight shadows. And watching them exhaust themselves attacking ghosts.